Welcome to the debrief, maggots. My name's Titanium Legman, and I can't keep doing this Red Guns impression or my actual throat will explode. What's up, everybody? I wanted to do a little bit of a discussion today about the sort of drama surrounding the 1.02 patch for Armored Core 6, why I think that people are kind of over-exaggerating the nerfs to bosses, and why people aren't appreciating enough the buffs to the various weapons that have occurred. I want to talk about both sides of that, and then sort of this whole discussion of like gatekeeping and weird, stupid nonsense that people have been getting into. So we're going to talk about all that. And if you enjoy my videos, you enjoy the content that I do, a like and a sub would be very much appreciated. I'm a small-time creator making YouTube my full-time career, and every little bit of help I can get is massively appreciated because it's really hard to grow in this ecosystem nowadays. So thank you very much. Now, what is it that people are kind of all bent out of shape over here? There's a couple things. First of all, there are the people who are upset that the bosses in Armored Core 6, or some of them, were nerfed in the 1.02 patch. I don't know the full extent of these changes yet. I don't know if they are fully researched and revealed yet, since FromSoft didn't give super specific answers about what was changed in terms of how the bosses function, but people have been testing things and figuring them out as they go. I know that primarily it seems that all that changed with Balteus was that his missile tracking became a little bit more forgiving. Sea Spider seems to have had its resistance to certain damage types reduced a bit, and then the Ibis series seemed to get its overall damage output reduced. But that's all of the changes that I've seen thus far with these bosses. And yet there's been this feeling of they changed it so now it sucks in the community that I don't agree with. Would I prefer to not see things changed in terms of how bosses function in a FromSoft game once release happens? Yeah, I think so. Because people develop an understanding of how those bosses work and a feel for how the game wants you to play it, or at least how it wants you to play in its sandbox. And then when something like that gets changed down the line, it throws that off, and that can feel weird, especially if you've been going really hard and learning bosses and doing challenge runs and things like that, like myself. However, I think in this instance, with these three bosses, these changes are actually quite justified. And so while I resonate with folks who maybe would rather not see these changes happen at all, and that kind of sentiment like, oh, well, I beat the boss when it was the most difficult, and as such, I'm going to hold on to that as a point of pride, which I think is fine and something we're going to talk about in a second. I do think that these changes were important. So we're going to talk about them, then we'll talk about the weapon changes last. First of all, with Balteus. This is one that I've seen people kind of be like, oh, they completely declawed Balteus. It's not the absolute roadblock that it once was. It's not going to filter people anymore, all that type of stuff. And I don't think that's true. The missile tracking on Balteus now being more forgiving, I actually think was a very good decision because the missiles were never the primary threat from Balteus to begin with. The actual threat from Balteus was the bazooka in Phase 2, the flamethrower swords, and then some of the other quick, snappy attacks it could do, the shotgun blast, the way it would chip you down with its Gatling gun, all that type of stuff. The missiles would hurt if they hit you completely, as I outlined in my beating Balteus with the starter AC, no upgrades, no OST chips video. But generally speaking, even when they were still able to track you extremely aggressively, if you were quick on your feet, you weren't going to get hit by that many of them, and they generally weren't going to deal that much damage. Now, the missiles are more of a shock and awe attention getter that distract you from actually dodging the important attacks, even more than they already were. And I think that's fine, because I feel like that's always been their intended purpose. So it fits that that attack now is a little bit more forgiving, so that way you aren't getting bodied by it potentially while you're trying to avoid the actually important attacks. It's serving as that distraction, and also it actually lines up with the way that missiles have worked in past entries in the Armored Core series. Generally speaking, in Armored Cores 1 through 5 and all of their various spin-off games in their individual series, if you successfully dodged a missile, it would gently curve past your AC, past the camera, and that would be that. That is how they have always felt in pretty much every game in the series. Until Armored Core 6, specifically with bosses like Balteus, where it seems like they can just do a 180 midair and still hit you anyway after you've seemingly dodged it. So now we have a situation where Balteus, as the first major boss in the game, still presents itself as this major roadblock, but is also true in some of its attacks to the way other bosses and fights have been in the past in Armored Core. And I think that's important. Maintaining that feeling of the way Armored Core works in 6, when we have the changes that we already do in like big landmark FromSoft boss fights that we never really had in the series prior to 6, is very important. I think keeping those roots is vital to make the series stand apart from FromSoft's other works and other series and all that type of good stuff. So that's why I like that change. For Sea Spider is not a boss that requires you to have a certain type of weapon to deal with it effectively and efficiently the way that Balteus is. Sea Spider doesn't have a shield that you pretty much need to bring down with some sort of pulse weapon if you want the fight to take place in a reasonable amount of time, especially when you're fighting it for the first time, not on like New Game Plus or whatever. Instead, Sea Spider is very much a forcing you to pay attention to attack patterns and forcing you to know that you need to either dodge quickly or stay above certain types of enemies so you don't get bodied by its attacks and have enough time in this sort of knockdown, drag out brawl of an attrition battle to have the weapons that you have deal damage to this big, hulking, armored monstrosity of a spider tank and bring it down. But when some weapon types, specifically very commonly used kinetic ballistic weapon types like machine guns, rifles, SMGs, stuff like that, had very, very low effective damage against Sea Spider because of the way its damage resistances were, it makes it harder for the lay player to understand that that's what the fight is about. In the same way that Balteus is a fight that's supposed to introduce the idea that like you're going to have to change up your core and maybe acquire certain types of parts or certain types of weapons to counteract certain types of situations, Sea Spider does the same thing, not by saying, hey, make sure that you have the rock that beats my scissors, but by making sure that you can put together a build that allows you to dodge effectively and stay airborne effectively. And that means changing up your weapons and maybe using lighter options than you were using, or faster options than you were using, or swapping out your lighter or your heavier hand weapons for lighter hand weapons so you can have a bigger cannon on your back and still stay mobile. That's kind of the point of Sea Spider. But by punishing players who might try to use lighter options like machine guns, SMGs, and rifles, by having them be far less effective than something like a handheld like rocket launcher, laser pistol, stuff like that maybe dealt more damage to Sea Spider, you're discouraging that sort of build crafting and diversity. So I do like to see this change with Sea Spider as the boss that's supposed to teach you that mobility and staying airborne are just as important as matching weapons to a foe's effectiveness. So I really do like to see that. And it's nice because ballistic weapons, rifles, and machine guns are staples of Armored Core, just as much as big honkin' laser cannons and grenade launchers are. So having them be effective in a boss fight like this really makes me happy, and that's something, again, we'll touch on when we talk about the weapon buffs later. Finally, the Ibis series. This one, I think, is interesting because it's probably the most direct nerf to one of the bosses that we've seen, if it's just the reduced damage that Ibis has, if that's the only major change to the boss from what I've been seeing in the community. It is. Maybe there's something else. But I think that it still works. And the reason I think it still works is much like Sea Spider is supposed to be teaching you about staying mobile and adapting your build to like keeping your energy up, having the ability to dodge and fly around a lot. And Balteus is all about making sure that you have the right types of weapons to deal with a specific enemy defense or weakness or whatever. I think Ibis is very much intended to make you go, oh, I need to be able to not only dodge and time my attacks, but actually keep the enemy in my sight lines. Learn to read its moves so I know where it's going to be going, and I can automatically, without even thinking about it, move my camera to stay locked on and be able to keep firing. Because you think about like Balteus and Sea Spider, they're either very big, they both are, or very slow. Sea Spider generally is. And it's not too hard to keep track of them because they're often on a horizontal plane at sort of eye level with you. Even though Balteus flies around, it generally stays pretty low. And when it's higher up in the air, generally speaking, it's going to be further away, and it's a pretty open battlefield, so you can see it. Ibis, not so much. Ibis is very small. it blends in with its background, and it moves way faster than Balteus or Sea Spider do. And as such, it can be really hard to keep track of it while also paying attention to where you're moving, how much energy you have, what weapons you have off of reload, or what weapons you have available, all that type of stuff, and pay attention to all that simultaneously while also keeping targeting on it. It's even harder to do that when nearly any attack that the boss throws at you, unless you're using like a super heavy build with massive defense and massive AP, can potentially two-shot you. That's rough. That's very, very rough. And while, yes, it contributes to the boss being way harder, and it's not like the boss was impossible, if the idea is that the devs are trying to show people the different types of combat scenarios that you're going to run into in an Armored Core game through the bosses, especially seeing as how this is the first entry in a long time, and by far the most seen, shall we say, entry in the series by people who haven't otherwise played Armored Core games, it makes sense that, again, with Ibis, they would want to show off that different type of combat scenario. Am I completely just projecting right now with like my read on how the bosses were kind of designed and what the design philosophy behind them was? Yes. But this is also how FromSoft has been for a long time, so I don't feel like it's a completely baseless assumption. So by reducing the damage that Ibis does with each of its attacks, while still having it be just as fast as it is, and having just as many attacks as it does, and having them be just as aggressive as they are, I think it helps foster that idea of I need to move, I need to track the boss, I need to be firing, I need to know what's off of cooldown, what's on cooldown, how much energy I have, and bring that whole package together of everything you've been learning over the course of the game. So again, I think that's fine. Now, does that mean that I think that people are justified in getting annoyed with those of us, like myself, who are proud of the fact that we beat these bosses while they were at their hardest? No. No, as a matter of fact, if you try to blame those types of people or accuse them of gatekeeping, of being elitist, of trying to look down on others, I would like to tell you, in no uncertain terms, please go fuck yourself. Okay? Let's make that extremely clear. Do not shit on people for being proud of having overcome something when it was at its highest level of challenge. That is just as rude and inconsiderate and toxic as people who are going to look down on you for wanting a game to be easier or being happy that the bosses are easier now because you have an easier time dealing with them. Okay? We can all coexist here. Don't be a douche, regardless of which direction that doucheism is flowing, all right? Good. I wanted to get that out of the way. For people who were able to successfully beat these bosses when they were, like, way, way, way hard, and it's not to say that they're easy now, but that's awesome, and we're allowed to hold on to that pride. Especially if we say to others, okay, now go ahead, go beat it, I bet you can, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is unfortunately something I've been seeing a lot on Twitter, on Reddit, of people getting so exasperated that folks who were able to take those bosses on before the patch are happy about that. Like, are people just not allowed to be happy now? No. No, I don't think that that's the case. So get off your goddamn high horse. And also, if you're someone who's out there, the more traditional, like, oh, well, I beat it where it was harder, so I'm better than you, stop. Just stop. There's no call for that. You got your personal enjoyment out of dealing with the boss at the level of difficulty or the level of challenge that it was prior to the patch. You own that. No one can take it away from you. Don't use it as a club against somebody else unless they're specifically being a dick to you in particular about it, all right? Defend yourself. Don't come out swinging unprovoked, okay? Cool. Just wanted to get that out of the way because I've been seeing a lot of that back and forth and I'm just so tired of it. Now, as for the weapon changes, I mentioned that at the start of the video, and I do want to talk about it a little bit now. There's not as much to say here because I don't think there's really any room to argue that having weapons that feel underpowered get buffed so that there's more build variety is a bad thing. But I did just want to say how happy I am to see rifles and machine guns and SMGs get the buff that they have. They're some of my favorite weapon types in Armored Core. You know, going back to Armored Core Nexus, I loved to have like a high power, high rate of fire machine gun in one hand for dealing with trash enemies, for dealing quick damage to fast targets, all that type of stuff. It was one of my favorite playstyles. And having like dual wielded SMGs while I'm flying around an arena, dealing with a bunch of MTs or even like LCs and HCs, stuff like that. It's just so much fun. It's part of the power fantasy for me with Armored Core, and seeing those weapons get ammo buffs, reload buffs, damage buffs, it's just good. And seeing how Armored Core 6 feels like it has the best diversity of build crafting in the series, specifically because there's not really any power crept weapons. Every weapon has its own unique niche that it can fit in that no other weapon really can. For the most part, there's a couple of small exceptions, but that it just makes me so happy to see more viability there. So I think that's great, and I would love to see other balance patches like that specifically for underperforming weapons to kind of bring them up to snuff. Specifically, even just for PvP or PvE. I know PvP is going to have its own patches, but just for the PvE experience, I'm happy to see stuff like that. I applaud FromSoft for doing it and doing it quick, and I hope to see more stuff like it in the future. And that, my friends, is pretty much my discussion of the 1.02 patch and sort of some of the drama around it and the changes that I'm aware of in terms of what has gone on in that patch. If there's stuff that I missed, if there's other information that comes to light that I didn't discover in this video or I didn't talk about in this video, by all means, put it in the comments so that I know and I can talk about it accurately in the future and maybe test out some different stuff, all right? So with that said, stop being toxic to each other, maggots. Polish your zimmies, reload them, get out there onto the battlefield, and take each other out in core combat. But get off of goddamn social media. Take it where it actually matters. I've been Titanium Legman. Hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there, and remember, be good to each other.